We took money from the poor and gave it to the rich, and we took money from the young who faced no risks at all from COVID, and we gave it to the super wealthy.
All lives go through periods of pain, and so it's quite natural for a lot of people just to say, well, life's not worth it.
All about this concept that mankind can create its own heaven. Mankind can create a utopian society. Every bloody attempt at creating a utopian society has failed miserably.
Well, welcome once again to the Aussie Wire News. I'm Topher Field, and in this episode, I'm coming to you from Brisbane. I'm at the Church and State Summit. It's the 7th annual summit. I'm going to be conducting interviews with some of the guests here, and this really is a faith episode. I'm going to be talking to people about church and state, about faith and private belief, and how that interacts with public policy. And this cuts to the heart of so many of the issues and challenges that we're facing today in this country. It cuts to the heart of everything from regulation and red tape and taxation through to woke culture and whether or not the government should be regulating things like speech, things like pronouns, whether we should be even going in that direction at all. There are so many of today's issues and challenges that we run stories on all the time that really do cut to the heart of this interaction between church and state. So without further ado, please enjoy this special episode of the Aussie Wire News. Well, I'm joined now by Professor James Allan, Professor of Law, and a man who I've heard described as Australia's Jordan Peterson. Make of that good or bad what you will. I've genuinely heard people describe you that way.
I'm a lot poorer.
Well, there is
put it in those terms.
But funny enough, your background originally is actually Canadian, is it not?
Toronto, and in fact, when he first came out, his very first tour, I introduced him in Brisbane.
Is that right? Yeah, wow. Well, you're someone that I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to your commentary over the years, and we're going to have to fight with vacuum cleaners and various other things. We're in the atrium of the Church and State Summit here in Brisbane. Now, James, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the Anglosphere. You're originally from Canada, you've spent many years in Australia, but you're very well travelled, and you're someone who I think sees the bigger picture. What we've seen in the last few years, COVID included, but not exclusively, is the Western world seems to have taken a very similar path in the last few years. Big spending, now leading to a lot of inflation, increases in the size of government, the intervention of government, these sorts of things. Why do you believe that's become the, or do you agree that that's the zeitgeist at the moment? Why do you believe that's the case?
Well, yes. I mean, it used to be that the Anglosphere was the best part of the democratic world, and now it's probably the worst in terms of cowardice amongst the political leaders. So my own take is there's an economic side of it, and there's a failure to fight the culture wars.
Right.
And in one way, the culture is more important than anything. I mean, I would sacrifice money out of my paycheck to have a sane schooling system and you know, people who stood up to men wanting to play in women's sports, that sort of thing. I do think that politicians have fallen victim to the fact that almost all of the economic advisors are Keynesians.
Yes.
And they're all afraid of any kind of recession. And so they sell people on the idea of GDP, which isn't a great measure, right? It's just a measure of economic activity, basically government spending of any sort. And so on that model, if you have an island of 100 people and you let 100 in that year, GDP has to go up.
Sure.
But what people never get told is your GDP per person has gone down. So Japan has almost no immigration, and their GDP per person is about the same as Australia's in the last 15, 20 years. And we have had 2 GDP per person recessions in the last little while. I don't know how many years, it hasn't been that many. And so in order to combat the fear of a recession, they print money, they had 0 interest rates. Sure, COVID made it way, way worse, but it was still bad.
Yeah.
And what happens when you have really low interest rates? We used to have the economic settings to favor savers. I come from a long line of Scots, Calvinists, sort of. You know, you should be rewarding savers. We reward borrowers, and inflation hurts saving.
Yeah.
And so if you have very low interest rates and print money like crazy, you inevitably have asset inflation. And poor people don't have assets, and rich people do. I mean, this happened on steroids during the thuggish years of the lockdown. It was the 3 best years to be a billionaire ever.
Yeah.
We took money from the poor and gave it to the rich, and we took money from the young who faced no risks at all from COVID, and we gave it to the super wealthy. And, you know, this was done by right-of-centre governments. They should be ashamed of themselves.
You've touched on so many great topics. So I want to come back to this issue of the asset inflation. You're absolutely spot on, and this is one of the things that I warned of very early in COVID.
I just want to be clear. I mean, if I had loads of assets, I might have a slightly different... They don't want to be too judgmental. We want to keep an open mind.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It depends on whether I benefited or not.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that Constantine Kissin, who's now touring in Australia at the moment, and I heard him at the ARC launch in London a little while ago, was warning against, is if we disenfranchise younger people because the assets are out of their reach, they've been inflated beyond the point where they can become homeowners, then in a sense we're disenfranchising them from settling down, having families, actually progressing through the stages of life that we would have called normal 20, 30, 40 years ago. Do you agree with that assessment, or what do you think the impact of what we've seen economically is likely to be going forward?
I do agree with that, but I think one of the even bigger factor is we're just letting, I mean, Australia's got the highest per capita legal immigration, and you're just letting so many people in, and there's so little, you know, development because of NIMBY rules, that also is driving up prices, and that's probably driving it up more. So in Britain, they've got these green belts, they're beautiful. Well, stop letting in so many people. I mean, I'm not against immigration, I am one, but it's just completely crazy compared to non-Anglosphere countries. I mean, Canada, Australia, Britain, it's insane how much we're letting in. And it's all to keep the GDP figures so that they're afraid of a newspaper saying, oh, we're in recession.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you're articulate like Poilievre, the opposition leader in Canada, you'll say, look, GDP's not a very good measure.
It's not.
And you'd fire half the Keynesians who run your treasury. I mean, they've been completely captured by one point of view in economics.
Okay, you mentioned Keynesianism twice, which broadly speaking, correct me if I'm wrong, is the Chicago School of Economics.
No, it's not. Milton.
Okay.
No, not Milton. It's Keynesian. It's I can't remember his first name. Maynard Keynes. Yeah. So it's all demand management, and your goal as a government is to, if the private sector's not doing it, is to step in and boost demand.
Right.
So even if that means hiring people to dig a hole and then filling it in. Sure. Right.
Otherwise known as council workers. That's what they do all day.
Except they don't really dig a hole. Well, but leaving that aside, yeah.
But that contrasts with as I understand it, again in my ignorance, the Austrian school of economics.
Yes.
So help us understand what would you like to see as a genuine alternative to this Keynesian view of economics?
Well, again, I'm not an economist.
Sure.
I grew up in a household of economists. My dad, my sister, my uncles. I'm the black sheep. I'm a lawyer. Nobody talks to me, I mean, for understandable reasons.
Yeah.
So I just would like to see people say, look, we're going to have the odd recession every once in a while, and this is just an inevitable fact of a capitalist economy. Instead of bending over backwards to try to spend and manipulate the settings so that you avoid that, and then it just builds up, and no one even thinks about paying back debt. I don't know what it is in the U.S. It's $1 trillion they're adding to their debt every 100 days.
Something like that. Yeah.
And so it's not too long from now that they'll be spending more on servicing the debt in the U.S. than they do on defense. And the Americans spend, I think it's down to 3%. When Reagan was in office, they spent 6% on defense.
Yeah, right.
And so, you have, if that's the world you live in, the idea that the Americans can finance a sort of Ukraine war forever is just implausible.
All right. Last question. As you look to the future, are you optimistic, are you hopeful, or are you not, and why?
I'm an optimistic sort of guy, but I'd like to see more people with a bit of bravery and fight in them. I totally understand that if you've got a mortgage and a young family, if you say things and they're going to fire you, it's very difficult to criticize. But there's an awful lot of people who are in a position where they could be braver and they're not. They don't want their friends at the dinner party to look down on them because they like Tony Abbott or something like that.
Or just to not get invited to the dinner party.
And I think what one of the biggest changes is if you go back 50 years, the sort of corporate, certainly this is true of lawyers, the median lawyer was politically to the right of the median voter.
Right.
Today, the median lawyer is about an order of magnitude plus to the left. They're just really left. Some of the most woke workplaces in Australia, go to a big Sydney law firm and go in, you better have your pronoun, and you'd be sued in tort if you said you liked Donald Trump because they'd all have a heart attack. So, I mean, and we saw this during The Voice.
Yeah.
The entire elite class, so not just the big civil servants, but all the corporations, the churches.
Yes,
everybody
sadly
came out for The Voice and it lost. This shows you that our elites are completely out of step. And again, I generalize, there's always outliers.
Sure.
But they're out of keeping with the average person. And that's a real problem. We've got to try to fix that. It would help if our conservative parties had a little bit of backbone. They don't, but it would be good if they did.
Well, hopefully that's something we can see change. James
Thank you.
Allan,
Yes.
what a pleasure.
You too.
One of my favourite things about coming to places like Church and State, we're here at the summit in Brisbane, is the fact that I know reliably I'm going to see Stephen Chavura. He's one of my favourite people to talk to debate, and to get into some serious conversation with. He's also a snappy dresser, which really annoys me, because I show up in sloppy joes and a t-shirt, and he's dressed, well, he looks like this. It's really frustrating. Anyway, Stephen, good to see you again. We're here at the 7th Church and State Summit. A lot of people kind of say, well, what's the point of conferences? You know, we're at the 7th one. Where have we changed the world yet? Like, come on, what's going on here? What's the value in an event like this from your perspective?
Oh, the value is always in basically getting people together who can make change, getting them to talk to one another, network with one another. So that's a very important thing. So, like, you and I would not have met if it wasn't for these kinds of events. And then also just informing people at the grassroots level in terms of what's going on in the world and in Australia, telling them what MPs, what politicians are on the side of good, what ones are not on the side of good, and just getting them to make a more informed vote. And no single conference is itself going to make the big difference, but over a long period of time, you know, things do change. Yeah.
So let's talk about change, because you said, you know, there are some politicians on the side of good and some who are not. Our culture has rejected the idea of God. So how do we know what's good and what's not?
Yeah. Well, so I think most people have a basic idea of what is good and what is evil, because when evil happens to them, they know it.
Sure.
And so I think at a basic level, but I do tend to think that at a sort of macro societal level, when the influence, particularly of Christianity, starts to recede into the background, it's not that people suddenly stop knowing what is good and what is bad, and even to some extent what is real in terms of biology and that kind of thing. But what happens is what they know is much more easily undermined and destabilized, because it's not really anchored to anything firm. So in the history of Christianity, we know what is good, we know what is evil, but that's also anchored to revelation, it's anchored to the Bible. And when you take away that cultural anchor, it's kind of sort of drifting there, and it can last for a while just drifting there, but then there are always alternative views and points of view that start to push it one way or the other, and I think that's where we are right now.
So in Marxism they had, and with Rules for Radicals and Saul Alinsky, etc., they had this idea of the long march through the institutions, and taking a multi-decadal view of their mission, which was to bring in Marxism culturally and then politically as well. Arguably, they've been quite successful in that.
There's no doubt about it, yeah.
Do you believe that there is a counter march necessary, and we reverse their tactics, or should there be a different tactical approach?
Yeah, I think we need a tactic, and the obvious thing that might first come to mind is that we need to sort of take back the institution, so sort of our own long march. I'm sort of a view that some of our institutions can't be redeemed anymore, like, for example, the universities.
Sure.
My opinion of the universities is that they cannot be brought back to sanity. They just need to collapse under the weight of their own irrationality. And that's kind of what's happening a lot. What do I think we need to do? Well, I absolutely think we need to be electing good people to stand as MPs, not just in Canberra and not just in the state level, but also representatives at the council level. But I also think I'm a big believer in this. Rather than trying to transform the whole media, rather than try to transform the schools and the universities, we start our own stuff.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what we've been doing. We've been starting our own schools, we've been starting our own home schools, we've been starting our own universities, and starting our own alternative media. And I mean, I'm speaking to someone who embodies everything that I'm talking about. You can sort of spend your whole life saying, oh, the mainstream media is horrible, we need to change it, what can we do, and basically being completely ineffective. Or you can get up and start your own thing. That's what you've done, it's what others have done. And so I'm actually a big believer in basically just starting up new stuff, which is what happened in the history of Christianity. Monasteries were started. They invented the modern university. They started hospitals. And we're in an age now, we're in a kind of age of ruins, of the ruins of a former great civilization. And we just need to start again. And that's why one of the great things that came out of COVID was this whole alternative media just rose up, and that was, I think, one of the most exciting things of that 3 years.
You've given me way too many threads that I want to pull on, so I'm going to go right back to the early part of your answer, talking about universities.
Yep.
I'm wholeheartedly on board, institution bashing when it comes to education. I was homeschooled way before it was cool, before COVID. When I was a kid, I was homeschooled. I'm all about it, but I will say, I don't want to walk across a bridge that wasn't designed by an engineer who really knows what he's doing. I don't want to have open heart surgery from someone who hasn't at least had someone look over their shoulder while they dissected a rat or something, right? So how do we balance this? I mean, we need education. Education's a wonderful thing. How do we balance the need for universities to be reformed at a minimum, if not collapse and be replaced? With the fact that we do need education, we do need people to be qualified.
Absolutely. I think one thing, and I'm probably guilty of it myself every now and then, that when we talk about the decline of the universities, to a large extent we're talking about the decline of arts and humanities departments.
Sure.
So the science departments are still doing great work.
Yep.
They have been touched a little bit by the wokeness, but by and large, good science is still being done. And so, absolutely, I would encourage, I mean, I never discourage anyone from going to university. I loved going to university, but certainly we want these higher education institutions because, as you say, the mathematics and the physics that you need to be able to build a decent bridge or create or design an aeroplane are not going to be learned at home school. Unless you happen to have
big homeschool fan, but I still agree.
That's right. And so I would just distinguish between a lot sort of the science departments in universities, which are doing a lot of good work. Although again, some of those departments are vitiated and corrupted by the insane sort of climate cult, and that's a bit of a problem. But overall, they're doing great stuff. The STEM stuff. It's really the humanities, law departments. They're the ones that are really just going nowhere.
Before I pick up, the second thread from your earlier answer I want to pick up on is your reference to councils and talking about that. But before we go there, I want to talk about humanities. It appears to me that humanities have actually become inhumanities. And there's a verse that often, as I watch the way the world is going and as I look at debates around euthanasia, abortion, and now even transgenderism, the verse that comes to me all the time is, those that hate me love death. And there seems to have been an emergence in this sort of post-God world where we've rejected God. We've now embraced death as a solution. Are you old and depressed? We'll just kill you. It'll be fine. Are you poor? We'll just kill your kid. It'll be fine. And even with transgenderism now, and this is only a relatively recent step in my mind, a post-operative transgender cannot have any kids. That is the end of their bloodline, and in a sense, that is a celebration of death once again for their bloodline. In what way are we now? I guess the humanities and our humanism has been turned into an anti-human philosophy.
Yeah, for sure. It reminds me of something Livy, the great ancient Roman historian, said. He's talking about the decline of the Roman Empire because it had become decadent, it had become prosperous, and so people were just becoming they're becoming self-interested, corrupt. And you know how he described the Romans? He said, "We've become in love with death." And
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it's not entirely clear what he means by that. But there does seem to be this theme that when we kind of detach our vision of what it is to be a human being from having an objective end, that we are created for a purpose, then all that's really left in terms of what should we be doing while we're alive is basically pursuing pleasure. Now, life in so many periods in our lives becomes very hard, becomes very painful. And if life is all just about pursuing pleasure and just pursuing happiness rather than pursuing God's glory, then in those moments in life where you feel much more pain than pleasure, it's understandable that someone would say, well, guess what? Life is no longer worth living. And so I think there's actually a connection that when we disconnect our concept of what it is to be a human being, what should we be doing from glorifying God, and you disconnect it from that, it naturally just becomes, well, I exist just to be happy and to experience pleasure. And all lives go through periods of pain. And so it's quite natural for a lot of people just to say, well, life's not worth it. And not only is my life not worth it, but in actual fact, I shouldn't bring up other people into such a horrible world. And so it actually becomes, as you say, so humanism detached from God becomes anti-humanism. And Livy saw something very similar in the 1st century BC AD.
Well, thank you. You've given me yet another thing I have to look up and read now. All right, last question. I want to come back to your comment on councils, because this is something I'm hearing. It's just popping up all over the place. Local politics and local government is not something that I heard talked much about when I was a teenager, when I was in my 20s. I've been a political commentator for 15 years. In the last 2 years, I've heard more about local councils than I have in the entire rest of my life. What's happening? Why are so many people going local councils? That's where the fight is.
Yeah, because basically over the last 30 years, everyone's just been looking at Canberra or at the state governments. And what's happened is in that period of time, a lot of people on the far left side of politics have just been getting walkthroughs, going into local councils. And it's actually not ridiculously difficult to get elected into local council. It's pretty easy. And so over the last 30 years, what has happened is basically a lot of Greens and a lot of radical leftists have gone into local councils, and they've started passing all sorts of laws and things regarding zoning, regarding environmental rules, crazy things regarding, regarding Australia Day, for example, not acknowledging Australia Day. So there actually is a really serious battle to be fought at the local council level. And the great thing about that is that A, local council is nowhere near as difficult to get onto as state and federal. And B, local council affects sort of your immediate everyday life much more directly than a lot of state and federal politics. So if your local council, for example, is debating whether or not to honour Australia Day. Again, that's not something coming from Canberra or from the state government. That's coming from your local council. And so you can actually have big, quick wins by getting involved in local council politics, and over time basically getting the radical left out and getting people with some common sense and actually some love for this country, notwithstanding. I mean, we have all been very critical of this country over the last few years, but at the end of the day, we would all rather live here than pretty much most any other countries in the world. It has still got a lot going for it, this country, even though it has badly let us down over the last 3 years. So, yeah, local council, there's a serious fight to be had there, and it's probably more low-hanging fruit there than anywhere else.
And I do agree. There is definitely a fight to be had. And Australia is definitely worth fighting for. I've been very critical of Australia as well, and I think with very valid reason. But the reason why is because we have so much potential and things. I mean, just imagine if Australia just kept getting better. We're already among the best countries in the world, but there's a sense that we've peaked. Let's not. What if we could turn that around? Thank you so much for this chat. I've really enjoyed it. I was just on local councils. They used to be about rubbish and footpaths and keeping the parks clean. My favourite recent example of the absurdity of local councils is, I think it was Moreland City Council down in Melbourne, holding a vote on a resolution for a ceasefire in the Middle East. And I can just imagine the leaders of Hamas and the leaders of Israel were sitting on that live stream with bated breath, waiting to see what was going to happen in this vote from the Moreland City Council.
That's right. That's exactly the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. And it can actually all be ended by people taking an interest in local council. But that's exactly the kind of rubbish. Local councils having foreign policies. Could you imagine anything stupider than that?
Stephen Chavura, always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Topher.
Well, I'm here with George Christensen. We are at the Church and State Summit in Brisbane. It's the 7th annual Church and State Summit. Now, George, you're a former federal MP. You were one of the good ones, if I may say so myself.
Thank you very much.
You stepped away from that. I don't know if you want to talk about that, because that was a bit of a thing in its own right. But what brings someone like yourself? You've been in the halls of power before. Why would you come to something like a Church and State conference?
Well, mate, I think it's important. I mean, I'm first and foremost a Christian, and if you believe in Christianity, you believe in the Lord's Prayer, you believe in a key phrase in the Lord's Prayer. Oh, we're going to get someone walking from us.
Sorry, we're in a busy, highly trafficked area. You're just going to have to put up with it. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So you believe in the Lord's Prayer, which actually says, thy will be done on earth as in heaven.
Sure.
So if you believe that, as I do, then we've got to try and make some of God's laws apparent here on earth. And that doesn't mean establishing a theocracy, but it means biblical ethics, biblical values in the way we go about government.
I think in particular, it's often, people look at the 10 Commandments and they say, oh, well, there's a lot of those laws that shouldn't apply today. Well, there's some of them that definitely should. And in theology, we see this idea of the two tablets. There are the tablets that concern our relationship with God. And we know in the New Testament that's an individual thing. But there are the tablets, there are the instructions that relate to our interactions with each other. And those really, when we're talking about Christian ethics, we're really talking about, you know, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and these sorts of ideas that that unfortunately, you know, we're seeing increasingly in society now, particularly if you look at the US, people are just openly, brazenly stealing and walking out with things, and we're being told that we're not allowed to think that that's wrong anymore.
That's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, look, you know, the Ten Commandments are actually the system that established law in fact, most of the legal systems in many countries actually derive from the Ten Commandments. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's this sort of push to do away with all sorts of things at the moment, and one of those is, as you say, thou shalt not steal. That's openly happening in many places in America. You're not allowed to touch them. Ridiculous. And this is what you get when a society starts to crumble. And I think that there is something to be said about all of that, actually, that's a bit more deeper. Western civilization, Topher, was tethered to Christianity. We didn't call it Christendom without a reason. Yeah. And so now it's been untethered, and that's been the case now probably since the French Revolution. Okay. It's been in the Enlightenment. It's been slowly and slowly coming to this point that we're at today, where it's moved from post-Christian to anti-Christian. But that mooring has been lost, and I think that Western civilization is now adrift. It doesn't know what it's about, and when you're a civilization that actually doesn't understand, doesn't know what it's about, you are doomed to decline. And I don't know there's actually arresting that. Now that's my position. A lot of people have different views on it. I think that we are in civilizational decline. It will eventually happen. We don't even recognise at the moment. Who does when they're in decline? I do fear for my child and perhaps grandchildren, and I hope, though, that the foundations that the remnant can leave will ensure that there is a good civilization that's going to spring up from here.
I suspect I'm a little more optimistic than you are in terms of where this all could lead. But I put it to you, people talk about we're a post-Christian society, we're a secular society now, we have a secular government. I think maybe that was true for a few decades, but I actually don't think that's true anymore. I think there is a new state religion that has crept in. Well, wokeism is one expression of it, but we see it in so many different ways. We see it in actually the worship of government itself. So you've been in Canberra, you've been in the halls of power, you've seen the inner workings and sort of seen behind the curtain, so to speak. What's the reality of government? Should we be entrusting these people and these institutions with the kind of absolute power that we are now giving them?
Absolutely not. That's the short response to it. I mean, look, you know, people who go into positions of power, myself included, have a little thing called ego. And, you know...
Everybody does, not just the ones that go into power. We all do. I'm guilty.
But especially those who go into power. What do they say? That politics is show business for ugly people. But anyway...
present company excluded, of course.
But the fact is that... you know, when you've got people with massive egos, not just on the front line of politics, but even in the background, people with what I call little Hitler syndromes, tin pot dictator syndromes, trying to control things, it is a recipe for disaster for liberty. And, you know, that is why we should try to limit government as much as possible and keep our personal freedoms intact. But yes, I think that it is right to say that there is a new state religion. The state religion is all about centralising power, all about government knows best, all about this concept that mankind can create its own heaven. Mankind can create a utopian society. Every bloody attempt at creating a utopian society has failed miserably, ended up with death, disaster and mayhem. And, you know, forever it will be the same.
But funnily enough, the only historical example that I can think of that might counteract that point that you've made is actually the establishment of the American Republic. I mean, the French Revolution, that was an attempt to create heaven on earth. That became hell on earth. Marxism became hell on earth. The one potential exception, and it's not a great example now, I mean, let's be honest, the American Republic is not doing well right now. But it could be argued that for quite some time they really did create, and I mean, certainly the most prosperous, but I would say for quite some time the freest nation on earth. Do you agree with that? And if you do, what was the difference there? What made that a success?
The difference was the linchpin of the whole thing was liberty, particularly religious liberty.
Right.
And instilling as much personal liberty in that whole experiment as they could and limiting government. I mean, there were, you know, founding fathers, the United States, I think it might have been Benjamin Franklin, but I may have the wrong person there, who said something of the kind of, you know, talking about King George and saying what we don't want to do is replace one tyrant over there for 1,000 tyrants here in terms of having representative government. So, you know, there's something from the get-go that was all about religious liberty, personal freedom. And when you have a state based on that, yes, it's going to be good. But, you know, eventually it just declines. And the United States is in rapid decline right now. Again, I think we're going to see President Trump back later this year, or when he's inaugurated next year. But even that is probably not going to change things for America in the long run.
Well, if you look at his first 4 years, he pushed through mandates for the untested vaccines. He was certainly a fan of lockdowns at the time, and he drove up their debt considerably. So whatever the good things may be, the fundamental underlying issue is that, yes, he's going to continue in broadly the same direction. Last question for you. There'd be people who would look at a conference like Church and State and say, well, there's nothing to talk about. The church is the church, the state is the state, and never the twain shall meet. What's the interaction here? Where do these things intersect?
Well, I think that there is a concern amongst Christian people about the direction, particularly in relation to social issues, right? And we, to a large extent, have accepted the fact that we have, I hate to say it, but we, you know, some of us anyway, accept the fact that we've lost the culture war on big issues like gay marriage, abortion. I hope and pray that there is a turning around, particularly on the abortion issue. But let me just say that what's happening is we're moving now beyond that to the point where you cannot express or have an opinion that is contrary to this, to the victorious in the culture wars. And that is the danger. That then goes from being something that's external to me, you know, to being, you know, affecting my personal freedom, where I can't say, write, or even think about something that's contrary to a state-held belief.
It's a return of blasphemy.
It is. This is why that analogy that there is a state religion, and I call it wokery, you know, that it is a religion. It is a faith, because now, you know, I have a good friend over in Germany, who's one of my work colleagues, Edward Proles. He just in the last 2 weeks fronted court, charged with blasphemy, but pretty much, but it wasn't called blasphemy, a hate crime. He posted a meme. That actually was having a dig at pedophilia, right? But talking about how some pedophiles hide behind the LGBTIQ movement, right? So this was the meme. It had the Trojan horse, rainbow colours, and pedophiles inside it. For that, he was found guilty by a German court of a hate crime, or for incitement of people to hatred against LGBTIQ people. Now, goodness me, can't we express ideas anymore? Can't we express thoughts anymore? I mean, there is no such thing really as group rights. There's individual rights, and that is it. And this idea that there's group rights is another part of the religion, the state religion that's currently going on.
Well, it's going to be interesting times ahead. I'm more optimistic than you. I guess as time passes, we're going to have to wait and see. I do think that there is...
I don't think everything's broken, Topher. No. I think that, you know, I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be saying continue to fight. I think in the long run, though, that civilization will continue to decline, but that means that doesn't mean that we just abandon the fight and walk away right now. We need to protect our own individual freedoms and the freedoms of our children.
And also just be faithful in the fight. You know, the battle is the Lord's, the outcome is the Lord's, but we're still called to be in it and be faithful in that. Well, George Christensen, thank you so much for speaking with us here at the Aussie Wire. Well, we hope you've enjoyed these 3 interviews that I conducted at the Church and State Summit here in Brisbane. It's the 7th Church and State Summit. If you haven't got your tickets to the Albury Triple Conference yet, then you can still grab those at tripleconference.com. The Church and State Conference is one of those 3 days in the Triple Conference. We're bringing the Friedman Conference. That's a political freedom-focused political conference. The Church and State Conference, which is about church and state and the interaction of private belief and public policy. And the inaugural Big Ideas for a Better Australia, because we believe the best is yet to come. All those 3 conferences being combined into one. It's coming up this weekend. It is it's in Albury, and it's March 15th to 17th, 2024. So do go to tripleconference.com, get your tickets. If you can drive into Albury, if you can fly into Albury, I do recommend you get there. It's going to be an absolutely fantastic weekend. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little inside look at the Church and State Summit. I hope you found it interesting. Whether you're someone who's a believer or not, there's a lot to learn from listening to each other, and I hope that you've benefited from today's episode of the Aussie Wire News. Now, you, of course, can follow us on all of our socials at the Aussie Wire. If you've missed past episodes of the Aussie Wire News, you'll find those at theaussiewire.com. And, of course, we'd love for you to become an insider. That's a financial supporter who makes it possible for me to be able to be at places like this and bring you stories like the ones you've seen today. The link for that is in the description. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.